Welcome back to our discussion of this great Chinese classic, the Tao Te Ching. I want to begin by briefly reviewing some of the highlights that we found in chapters 1 and 2 of Book 1, so that those are fresh in our minds as we begin to work further into the text. We introduced this very complex idea of a Tao, of a way of behaving, a way of living, but also the way that the universe works. Also, a way of talking, a way of thinking, a way of understanding these things. And I want to remind you that it's going to be important to keep all of these many meanings of the word Tao in play, all of them in mind as we talk about the Taoist understanding of life. Because if we're using this word in the sense that it's used in the text, and in the way that a Taoist thinker would think about it, all of these meanings are present at once, not as alternatives, but as a kind of complex of meaning for the term. That's going to be important for us. But for us, primarily, we're going to be thinking about what the Tao Te Ching says about how we ought to live our lives. Now, the Tao Te Ching, in emphasizing the Tao of life, as we've seen, begins with a kind of critique of the way that words or names, as we've seen in the translations, function in the Tao of our lives. Part of what was going on in that first chapter was emphasizing that we get trapped by our language in an important way. And in getting trapped by language and by the concepts that language encodes, we manage to impede our own naturalness. How do we do that? We do that because we tend to think of the meanings of our words, the content of our concepts as fixed. And as we think of those meanings as fixed and the concepts as fixed, we think of them as somehow reflecting the nature of reality. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. One reason that it's important is because of the Confucian background against which Taoism is reacting. Because the Confucians were so focused on this idea of ritual correctness, of propriety, of etiquette. And that involves saying the right thing at the right time, calling each other by the right name, calling things by their right names. And the Taoists are worried that there aren't any right names, there aren't any right things to say, that names are flexible tools whose meaning changes with context. But the second piece of that is that we get trapped by these names, we get trapped by these concepts into thinking that the reality that we experience through these names and concepts is reality as it actually is, as opposed to a kind of projection of our own thinking. And in doing that, we put ourselves out of touch with reality. And if the goal of our lives is to live in a kind of harmony with reality, to live in a way that reflects our own nature and the nature of things around us, that's an obstacle, not an achievement. Finally, the other important piece of this is that by naming things, by describing them, we pick them out against a background. We pick them out as significant against a background that we regard as relatively less significant or insignificant. And in doing that, we tend to experience the world around us as a bunch of discrete objects, some of which are beautiful, some of which are ugly, some of which are good, some of which are bad, some of which we like, some of which we don't like, some of which are us, some of which are other people, and so forth. And we kind of chunk it up. And the Taoist idea, when we think about the Tao, the great way that things are, is that reality doesn't come in chunks. Reality is a seamless whole. And our lives aren't a single important chunk that looks at all the other chunks, but are rather parts of those seamless wholes. And so that if we want to act in a sensible way, a fluid way, a way that's spontaneous, we have to stop that chunking. We have to stop that interaction with the world through this artificial web of conceptualization. And finally, we saw in chapter 1 and in chapter 2 this discussion about the importance of seeing things as relative to one another as opposed to seeing them as absolute. That so often this reification, this seeing of things as independent objects, arises from this tendency to take terms that are in fact relative, and indeed relative to our own perspectives, and to see them as absolute descriptions of reality. Once again, from the Taoist perspective, that's what all of this Confucian cultivation, all of this cutting, polishing, grinding is about. It's about reifying and crystallizing a view of reality that only gets in the way. Today, we're going to build on that discussion. We're going to be focusing today on the Taoist conception of Wu Wei. Now, as we saw in our discussion of Confucianism several lectures ago, and in our discussion of Taoism in the last lecture, Confucianism and Taoism share a valorization of Wu Wei, as I said, sometimes translated as non-action or inaction, but better translated as effortless or spontaneous action. This is a really important respect in which these classical Chinese traditions differ very much from anything that we have seen in the Western tradition, except in this wonderful echoing of Aristotle's idea that virtuous action is action that we sort of do voluntarily and joyfully. But that's only a faint echo. The real issue here is understanding the good life, understanding the meaningful life, the life that we strive for, as a life lived spontaneously, as a life in which we don't need to explicitly think about, deliberate about, and choose each action we perform. Again, you might want to contrast this with the perspective of the Bhagavad Gita, in which the central idea is that at every moment we're choosing, and that we need to be choosing reflectively, consciously. The Confucians and Taoists, Chinese perspective in general, agree that that's precisely what we don't want to be doing. We don't want to be living a life of deliberation, a life of constant thought, a life of choice, but rather a life of effortless spontaneity. The only question, the big question between the Taoists and the Confucians is, what's the right analysis of that kind of effortless spontaneity, and how do we achieve it? So today, we're going to be looking at the Taoist negative account of the achievement of this kind of spontaneity and how it constitutes a critique of the Confucian positive account. And what we'll be doing is looking at that through what the Taoists see as the dangers of cultivation and of getting trapped by language. We'll move from there into a discussion of Taoist ethical and moral theory and conclude with a discussion of what action looks like in the context of Wu Wei, in the context of effortless action. So we're going to begin by reading together from chapter 3, and once again we're in Red Pine's translation, one that I personally enjoy just because of how it makes the language sing. But again, I emphasize there are many good translations, many very different translations of this text. So in chapter 3, the text reads, "Bestowing no honors keeps people from fighting. Prizing no treasures keeps people from stealing. Displaying no attractions keeps people from trouble." Let's think about that for a minute. Bestowing no honors keeps people from fighting. What does that mean? Well, again, the Taoist is sharing with the Confucian an interest in a peaceful, harmonious, well-ordered society. Think about what happens when it's time to give prizes at the end of the year at school, or when Nobel Prizes are announced from Oslo, or when most valuable player awards are announced at the end of seasons. Immediately, somebody's really happy they got that prize. But a whole lot of other people start complaining and bitching and moaning and talking about how the decision is really political and why did he get it or why did she get it and what could the judges have been thinking, and the jealousy begins and the suspicion of the process begins and so forth. Now, we tend to focus on the winners and those big smiles on the podium and showing the medal and, their statements about how much they love all of us little people who helped them get that and all that stuff. What we don't focus on is that background, the fact that every time the award is given, there's so much dissatisfaction as well. We need to question, the Taoist suggests, which is it appropriate to focus on and where the cost-benefit analysis is. Prizing no treasures keeps people from stealing. Again, pretty obvious. Theft is motivated when things are seen as especially valuable and important and available only to a few places. So the positive value of having treasure is often valorized without noticing the negative content that it creates covetousness. Thus the text says, "The rule of the sage empties the mind but fills the stomach, weakens the will but strengthens the bones." Some very nice metaphors here. When we talk about emptying the mind but filling the stomach, the metaphor here is this. The mind is the part that's doing all the conceptualizing, positing. This is really good. That's bad. I want that. I need that. Picking things out against the background. But the idea of the stomach is the metaphor here for naturalness, because it's natural to get hungry when our stomach is empty. Our stomach kind of drives us through instinct, the mind through calculation. So when the text says that the rule of the sage empties the mind but fills the stomach, it means it's sort of this, that if you're smart in administration, you get people to stop calculating and thinking about things, but to work spontaneously. Weakens the will. That is, it stops people from striving after these very particular goals, right? Identifying this award as what I'm trying to get. This prize is what I'm trying to get. This achievement is what I need to do. But strengthens the bones, creates a healthier structure. So here again, we have an emphasis on getting rid of the foreground, toning it down a bit, paying attention to the background, lower the contrast on life. It's a nice way to think about it. It's also suggesting that there are big problems that arise when we fix models of success. We get envy, we get a monolithic model of excellence that occludes other possibilities. And it also reflects the idea that there's not one way of doing things. That person who got the Pulitzer Prize for journalism, well, that doesn't suggest that's the only way to do journalism. But the prize emphasizes the only way, and so it misses all of the other ways. It establishes intuitively, if not explicitly, one Tao as constant, as permanent, and occludes all of the other options. And that's why we want to empty that mind and fill the stomach, to reduce greed, and so forth. We could see this as a model of living softly, or as I like to think about it, living at low contrast. We're next going to turn to chapter 38. And in chapter 38, we're going to be looking at the Taoist valuation of effort and of conceptualization when we go about thinking about moral action. Because think about this for a minute. When we hit Aristotle a bit earlier in this course of lectures, we noticed that Aristotle emphasized that virtue required effort. It was hard to be good. We had to strive for it. We had to cultivate ourselves. We had to develop virtue. And happiness required, and virtuous action required, a lot of conceptualization. It required us to have practical wisdom, skill in deliberation, skill in making the right choices. That view is shared in the Confucian account. That is, becoming a cultivated person with ritual propriety, filial piety, and so forth, requires a great deal of effort, grinding, polishing, and so forth, and a great deal of thought, understanding those classics, understanding what's to be done. We're going to see that the Taoists are going to reject all of that. We're also going to see an explicit denigration of Confucian accounts of justice and of ritual. And there's a beautiful irony in this passage. And I want you to pay attention to the language and the poetry, because there's a very pretty, ironic account of what happens to societies as they focus on morality. And it has a lot to say about contemporary American society, I think. So we're in chapter 38. When the way is lost, virtue appears. When virtue is lost, kindness appears. When kindness is lost, justice appears. Let's stop at this point and talk about this for a moment. What's the way? That's the Tao. That is just spontaneous behavior in accordance with nature. When we lose the ability to do that, When we suddenly lose our spontaneity by getting caught up in our conventions, in our concepts, in our focus on the foreground and ignoring the background, we need some way to get us to behave. And what we get is a doctrine of virtue, the doctrine of day, the doctrine of moral obligation, and so forth. So we study how we should behave. The Confucian idea is that this is often one thought too many. I'm going to give you an analogy that comes from a wonderful discussion in Western philosophy. Suppose that you were sick in the hospital and your friend came to visit you and you said, "It's so kind of you to come." And she said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I thought about it morally and I thought that I was obligated to come and that's what virtue demanded, so that's why I came." One thought too many. All of a sudden, an act of spontaneous kindness that you would have enjoyed, an act of spontaneous engagement, a way of being, got replaced with virtue. And all of a sudden, things aren't quite so beautiful as you thought they were. When virtue is lost, kindness appears. Now we're moving down the Confucian hierarchy, right? When we don't any longer have our virtue, then we have to instruct people to at least be kind to one another. They might not be honest, they might not be following all of their duties, but at least be nice. But what happens when kindness is lost? When people stop even being nice to each other, then we need justice. Then we need the courts. Then we need somebody to say, all right, if you're not going to be nice to each other, at least be fair. So now we've got a hierarchy. The way, the natural way of being, then virtue, then kindness, then justice. And notice how much in our society we think of justice as one of those highest virtues, something exalted. The Taoist here is putting it way down on the hierarchy. But what happens when justice is lost? I'll read to you. When justice is lost, ritual appears. And ritual marks the waning of belief and the onset of confusion. Now, of course, having just been paying attention to all of this Confucian doctrine, we see what the target is here, right? That if you lose even justice, then what people do is start going ritually through the forms of behavior. And there's not even any pretense that there's fairness or equity anymore. We're just doing what one ought to, behaving comme il faut. And at that point, as the text says, we've got the waning of belief and the onset of confusion. People are just behaving in particular ways, only because they know that's the way people behave. That's the right way to behave. They're putting the fork on the left and the knife on the right, but they're not worrying about whether, each person has an appropriate share of the food, let alone being nice to each other, let alone behaving virtuously, let alone behaving spontaneously. So in this wonderful chapter on morality, we see a kind of negative valuation of effort in what it takes to be human. In each of these stages, we see etiquette, propriety requires more effort of us, conscious effort moment to moment, than does justice. Justice requires more effort than does kindness. Kindness requires more effort than cultivated virtue. Cultivated virtue requires more calculated effort than simply behaving naturally and humanly. So the idea here is that the most effortless kind of behavior, the most spontaneous kind of behavior is the best. Effort, cultivation, striving, thinking about what we're doing emerge only as necessities when we lose our character, when we lose what's really important. We also find here, more specifically with respect to the kind of Confucian context, a specific denigration of justice and ritual, a specific denigration of the explicit forms of behavior, forms of social intercourse, and the most ritualized, calcified, specified, and explicit forms of social interaction. If we think about justice, the signing of contracts, courtroom procedure, and if we think about ritual in this highly etiquetized sense of ritual, where each kind of interaction has its own form of language, its own form of behavior, then what we're thinking about is the most fossilized forms of interpersonal interaction in which we engage. The most fossilized, the least natural. those are often the ones that people valorize as the foundations of our social order. The Confucians, for instance, valorize those. They see this regularization, this polish, this enforced politeness, this correctness, and the proceduralization of daily life as what generates stability in society. This is the foundation of bureaucracy. It's the foundation of procedural justice, and it's the foundation of high society etiquette. It does keep everything quiet and keeps the frozen smiles on people's faces. The Taoist point, though, is that what it freezes is genuine human interaction. It freezes it out completely, and genuine human interaction and a genuine enjoyment of our lives absolutely vanishes. So we have this wonderful sequence. The highest stage of morality is Tao, harmony with the way of the world, living naturally and spontaneously. The next level down, cultivated virtue, at least having internalized moral qualities that are beneficial. The next level down, studied kindness, not spontaneously doing what you know to be right because it's internalized, but asking yourself, what would the nice thing to do be? The next one down, justice, this kind of ritualized, fossilized, legalized way of dealing with one another. So if we can't be nice, at least we don't get into fistfights in public and start wars. And the evil gets punished and the good gets rewarded. And when justice falls apart, what we have is ritual. And the Taoist point is that every one of these steps of denigration, every step in which we degrade ourselves from a natural state to a totally artificial state, occurs through a single kind of process, cultivation. Cultivation, this positive sense of cultivating ourselves as social human beings as conceived in the Confucian framework. So the idea is, if you begin by people behaving spontaneously with the Tao, and then we ask ourselves, how can we bottle that? How can we cultivate it so that we can train it? What do? We ask, what are people like who behave in this way? And we catalog a set of virtues, something that Aristotle does, something that Confucius does. And so we cultivate those virtues. Then we might ask ourselves, okay, now we know what those virtues are. What kind of person do you need to be in order to become virtuous? And we say, you've got to cultivate kindness, right? That's really important. You've got to turn people into people who think in this particular way. And so we cultivate kindness. And then you might imagine talking to a child about how to be kind. And it moves into be fair to each other, be nice to each other, and we cultivate justice. And finally, we teach please and thank you when we lose all other hope. But for the Taoist, this is exactly what the Confucian model of cultivation is. It's a successive destruction of natural life through civilization. So what we see here is this whole idea that these rigid Confucian concepts destroy our spontaneous perception and engagement. They set up these kind of unattainable goals. And we're going to begin now to see how that emerges through the destructive forces of language and cognition and their particular role in cultivation of this kind of reflective, goal-driven approach to life as opposed to a spontaneous, natural version. So we're going to move back now to chapter 12. And chapter 12 has a wonderful set of paradoxes, but a wonderful set of paradoxes with a very, very deep point. The critique here will be specifically a critique of language, conceptuality, and their role in cultivation. So the chapter begins like this. The 5 colors make our eyes blind. The 5 tones make our ears deaf. The 5 flavors make our mouths numb. Now let's think about that. What in the world could the Tao Te Ching mean when it says that the colors, or as it's sometimes translated, the 5 colors, make our eyes blind, and that the 5 tones make our ears deaf, the 5 flavors make our mouths numb? Well, the 5 tones are the 5 tones in the Chinese classical scale. The colors are the colors that we can name: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and so forth. The 5 flavors are the classical 5 basic flavors in Chinese cuisine. What does that mean, that they blind us, deafen us, and numb our mouths? Just this, that if you conceptualize the color, you conceptualize it discretely. So if we name something red, then we tend to see scarlet, crimson, brick red, and so forth, all as the same color. We see sky blue, indigo, navy blue, all as blue. And so what we do is we take a varied, multifarious world towards which we could just open our eyes and see a wide colored palette, and we restrict it into boxes defined by conceptual categories, defined by the words and concepts we have. The 5 tones enable us to hear maybe a perfect, dominant tone or a perfect tonic, but they deafen us to the notes in between, to the quarter tones we might hear in an Indian scale. And you can hear this yourself. Many people who grow up listening only to Western classical music, when they listen to Indian music, think everything is out of tune because their ears are tuned to just hear the 5 tones, as it were, or the 8 tones or the 13 tones, depending on how you think about the Western scale. And so the Tao Te Ching is pointing out that conceptualizing and freezing these categories doesn't help us to hear, doesn't help us to see, doesn't help us to taste, but rather breaks a continuous reality into pigeonholed little bits, and so occludes reality, doesn't reveal it. Riding and hunting make our minds wild. Hard to get foods make us break laws. Again, you can see how that works. A lot of the things that we encourage as such great things, in fact, just cause trouble. Thus the rule of the sage puts the stomach over the eyes, thus he picks this over that. And the idea here, of course, it's the same metaphor. The right thing to do is take instinct over conceptuality. Allow yourself to hear, allow yourself to see, allow yourself to taste, and stop the labeling. And do your choosing instinctively, not conceptually. Now, let's move into morality more explicitly. And we're going to see a kind of recap of some of these important discussions that we saw earlier. In chapter 18, the text says, when the great way disappears, that is, when we lose our ability to harmonize with the Tao, we meet kindness and justice. We've seen that. We already know how that one goes. But now listen to how it continues. When reason appears, we meet great deceit. That is, what we need to do in order to get ourselves to be dishonest is to start the conceptualization going. Dishonesty doesn't come from instinct and natural behavior. It comes from calculation. When the 6 relations fail, we meet obedience and love. That is, when our natural relationships to other people fail, we need to tell people how to behave. Listen to your father. Do what your mother says. You need to love your grandmother right now. And of course, all of that creates this artificial, cramped behavior that's nothing like human behavior. And when the country is in chaos, we meet honest officials. The need for officials in the first place, the need for sheriffs and judges, only emerges when we have chaos. If things are behaving naturally and orderly, we don't worry about them. These officials only get their point from trouble. The background is what we ought to pay attention to. If we care about our officials, it's because there are problems to solve, not because our officials are so wonderful. And so the text admonishes in chapter 19, get rid of wisdom and reason, and people will live 100 times better. Get rid of kindness and justice, and people will once more love and obey. Get rid of cleverness and profit, and thieves will cease to exist. But these 3 sayings are not enough. Hence let this be added. Wear the undyed and hold the uncarved. Reduce self-interest and limit desires. Get rid of learning, and problems will vanish. The uncarved and the undyed. Return to nature. Don't try to create new cultivation. Get rid of those Confucian ideas. And so the text is urging us that morality is harmed, not helped by sophistication, cultivation, and structure. Our social structures and our artificial values that they embody induce not human progress, but decadence and corruption. And the Taoists argue that the best life is the simple, natural life, not this life of sophisticated cultivation. That's why we have such a serious critique of the Confucian view. And so the Tao Te Ching can say, the Tao does nothing, and yet there's nothing it doesn't do. In Wu Wei, in effortless spontaneity, we get productive action. Remember what we learned in the Bhagavad Gita. Action is always necessary. Refusing to act is itself an action. So oftentimes, not doing something is exactly the right thing to do. If we live our lives peacefully and calmly in harmony with nature, we can calm others. And sometimes the best thing we can do to a life isn't to add more to it, but to cut away. Just as sometimes the best thing we can do to a garden isn't to add more bushes and more trees, but to prune the ones that we have. And once again, what we see in the Taoist perspective is that it's that negative space, the place to go back to, that's the most significant, not the positive stuff that's in front of us, even though the negative space is so hard to see. So this concludes our kind of exploration of Wu Wei, spontaneous, effortless action, and the nature of inaction. This focus on a kind of self-cultivation by reduction, rather than a kind of construction of an ability to achieve external goals, a discarding of conceptual thought, a valorization of natural perception. Stay with us until the next lecture, and we'll go even deeper into the Tao Te Ching, and we'll see how this idea of Wu Wei works itself out in action.